The North Atlantic, year 985. 32 men packed into an open wooden boat on a sea the color of slate. No roof above them, no walls around them, no fire burning anywhere on board. They have been out there for 18 days. The water beside them sits 2 degrees above freezing. The air above them drops to 20 below. And almost every one of them will step onto Greenland alive. That should not be possible. Put a modern person into that same boat, dressed exactly as they were dressed, and they do not make it to morning. So what did the Norse understand that we have forgotten? Not toughness, engineering. A system so precise that modern science took another 800 years to catch up to it. And the final piece of it has nothing to do with the ship at all, the boat that shouldn't work. Let me ask you something. If I handed you a clean sheet of paper and told you to design a vessel for the deadliest ocean on Earth, what is the first thing you would draw? A stove? A cabin? Some source of heat? The Norse did the opposite. They built their ships with no heat source whatsoever. And we know this because we have pulled their ships out of the ground. The Gokstad ship, excavated from a Norwegian burial mound in 1880, runs 23 meters long and 5 meters wide, the length of a tennis court, the width of a minivan. Now load 35 men into that space along with their weapons, their food, and their cargo. There is barely room to stretch out. The sidewalls rise a single meter above the waterline. That is the entire barrier between the crew and the sea. Every wave breaking over the bow lands directly on a man's chest. Every gust of wind reaches the crew with nothing in its way. The numbers that should kill you. Here is what they were sailing through. Winter surface temperatures around 2 degrees, air at -20, pushed lower by wind chill. At those numbers, exposed skin frostbites in under 10 minutes, fall in the water, and hypothermia research gives you less than 15 minutes before unconsciousness. You do not get sleepy. Your body stops. And even if you never go over the side, sitting on an open deck in that wind hour after hour drains your core temperature until you fail. Why not just light a fire? So the obvious question, why not build a fire? Because the ship is built to burn. Pine and oak planks riveted together, caulk made from tarred animal hair, wool, rope, sailcloth soaked in fat. Every surface on board is fuel. The hull flexes with every wave, which means gaps open and close constantly, letting any stray ember find its way somewhere it should not be. One spark jumps, and the thing keeping you alive becomes the thing that kills you. The Norse were not ignorant of fire. They kept hearths burning year-round in every longhouse on land. They simply understood what fire does to a wooden hull in a crosswind well enough to leave it ashore. Which brings us to the real question of this whole story. How do you keep 30 men alive for weeks on an open wooden platform above a freezing ocean without the oldest survival tool in human history? The answer is not one answer. It is a system, 4 layers of one, and every layer is smarter than the last. Kill the myth first. First, kill the image in your head, the grim bearded warrior gritting his teeth against the cold, toughing it out. That man never existed. The archaeology tells a different story entirely. Every decision the Norse made about cold at sea was deliberate, calculated, refined across generations of hard crossings. They were not enduring the North Atlantic. They were taking it apart, piece by piece. Layer 1. The wool start at the skin. Wool, but not the wool you know. Norse sheep grew a dual coat fleece with 2 distinct fibers, long coarse outer hairs called tog, dense fine inner fibers called thell. One repelled water from outside, the other trapped heat against the body. And here is the part that sounds insane until you understand it. The Vikings barely washed their wool. They rinsed garments in cold seawater and otherwise left them alone. That was not laziness. That was the point. Washing strips out lanolin, the natural wax coating every fiber, and lanolin is hydrophobic. Water runs off it. A lanolin-heavy tunic sheds rain the way a modern rain shell does, and we are not guessing about this. Fragments recovered from the Birka burial site in Sweden and the Oseberg burial site in Norway show tight diamond twill weaves engineered to block wind and trap air. Researchers at the National Museum of Denmark built recreations and put them through the tests. The garments retained 80% of their insulation even when soaked through. 80% wet. The high-end synthetic base layers sold today to soldiers and climbers cannot match that figure. Viking wool, wet, kept working. There is a real argument among scholars about whether this was accident or design. Did the Norse stumble into the perfect seagoing textile because it was what their sheep happened to produce? Or did they refine it deliberately across centuries at sea? I have my own answer. Tell me yours in the comments. I read them. The wool was layered, a lena underneath, a light inner garment, a kirtle over it, the main woolen tunic, a heavy outer cloak on top, treated with tallow or beeswax for extra water resistance. 3 layers, 3 jobs. Walk into any outdoor store today and look at what they are selling you. A moisture-wicking base layer, an insulating mid-layer, a wind and water shell on top. The same 3-layer principle, worked out in modern laboratories with synthetic polymers, sold back to you at a price that could fund a small expedition. The Norse arrived first with sheep and a loom. Layer 2, the ship itself, but clothing only handles heat loss through the skin. Sit in that boat long enough, and cold starts reaching you through every surface you touch. The deck under your boots, the thwart you lean against, the hull itself. This is where most tellings of Viking seafaring miss the point entirely. The ship itself was doing thermal work. That clinker construction, the signature overlapping planks riveted together and sealed with tarred wool, is usually explained as a way to let the hull flex in heavy seas. That is true. A rigid hull cracks where a flexible one bends, but every one of those overlapping seams also trapped a thin pocket of still air along the inside of the planking. On its own, each pocket is meaningless. Stacked across the length of the ship, they became a continuous cushion of dead air between the crew and the ocean, pressing against the other side of the wood. Not dramatic. Nothing about this system is dramatic. Survival at the edge does not work in leaps. It works in fractions of a degree, stacked. Layer 3, the sail as a windbreak. What comes next is almost embarrassingly simple, except that European navies took centuries to figure it out. If this is the kind of detail you come here for, a like genuinely helps the channel. Now, wind. The Norse did not use the sail only for propulsion. Saga accounts and the Skjaldeleiv reconstructions sailed out of Denmark in the 1990s both show crews repositioning sails as windbreaks when conditions turned. Drop the sail partway, angle it across the beam, not for speed, for shelter. Some accounts describe spare sailcloth rigged over the middle of the ship as a rough canopy, stitched from wadmal, a densely woven wool, dense enough to block wind without sealing the crew inside a stagnant pocket of damp air. Cut the wind across a human body by half, and you double the time before hypothermia sets in. That is a measured figure. The Norse did not measure it. They watched men live and watched men die and learned which side of the cloth each one had been sitting on. Layer 4, the hudfat. Now we come to the piece of the system that is the most sophisticated and the most human. The Norse did not sleep alone. They slept stacked inside shared sacks called hudfat, sewn from walrus hide or seal skin. Fur turned inward, each one sized for 2 or 3 men. The hide blocked wind and sea spray. The fur held heat. The men inside were the heat source. This was not improvisation. The saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Eric the Red both list hudfat as standard equipment, as non-negotiable as the oars or the sail. Fragments of hide sacks consistent with those descriptions have turned up in Norse Greenland settlements. Crews rotated through them in shifts. Row, stand watch, rest, repeat. A man coming off 4 hours at the oars climbed into a sack still warm from the previous sleeper, whose turn at the oars had just begun. No sack went cold. No heat was wasted. The rotation itself was the engine. Do the math. A human body at rest generates about 80 watts of thermal energy. 2 bodies sealed inside a hide sack, 160 watts. A large incandescent bulb running continuously inside a space the size of a coffin, sealed against wind and water. Interior temperatures climbed 15 to 20 degrees above the outside air. Not comfort, not warmth in any normal sense. just enough to keep a human being on this side of the line where the body stops working. And there is something the thermodynamics cannot measure. Darkness at sea is not the darkness of a bedroom. Wind that has been blowing for 3 days does not sound like wind that stops at nightfall. Men break in those conditions. They have broken in far easier ones. Pressed against another human body inside a hide sack in the black, you get a reminder every few seconds that you're not alone out there, that the crew is intact, that the system is still holding. Anyone who has spent a winter night in a bivy bag, or a cold weather foxhole, or cold water survival training knows exactly what I am describing. If that memory just surfaced for you, tell me about it in the comments. The hidden layer, the harbor network. And then there is the fourth layer, which almost never gets told, and which might be the most impressive of all. The Norse did not only manage cold on the ship, they managed the entire route so they would face as little of it as possible. Archaeological surveys have identified more than 200 Viking Age harborage sites along the Norwegian coast alone. Not random anchorages, infrastructure, spaced roughly a day's sail apart, sheltered bays where crews beached their ships, built fires on shore, cooked hot food, dried soaked wool, and rebuilt their core temperature before the next leg. The longest open water crossing in their world, Norway to Iceland, ran about 900 nautical miles, 4 to 6 days of unbroken exposure at longship speed. The Norse sailed it, overwhelmingly, in summer, late May through August, when daylight stretched past 20 hours and the air stayed survivable. When winter sailing could not be avoided, they hugged the coast, short hops, harbor to harbor, never more exposure than the system could absorb. Step back and see the whole shape of it. The Viking cold water system was not just wool and hide and shared body heat. It was a network of harbors spanning thousands of miles of coastline, tied to seasonal timing, tied to route selection, tied to weather knowledge passed down as oral tradition. A maritime infrastructure the rest of Western Europe would not match for another 500 years. That is not survival instinct. That is the architecture of a civilization that understood the sea better than anyone alive on Earth. The landing. Pull back from the details. Men crossing the most dangerous water on the planet in open wooden boats with no engines, no satellites, no laboratory-designed gear. What they had was a system. Wool that modern science took centuries to improve on. A hull doing thermal work nobody gives it credit for. Sleeping arrangements that turned human beings into heating units on a shift schedule. A coastline engineered into a chain of safe harbors. None of it accidental, all of it paid for in generations of lives. They were not men who survived the cold. They were men who removed it from the equation. And every piece of what they built still makes sense today. So the next time you reach for the thermostat on a winter night, remember this: 1,000 years ago, 30 men crossed an Arctic sea with nothing but wool, hide, and each other, and they got there. If you want more history that treats these people as the engineers they were, instead of the cartoons they usually get turned into, subscribe. There is a great deal more to tell.